She hasn't been part of this family in years, my uncle said to the mediator, his voice measured and rehearsed. My aunt nodded beside him, hands folded over a thick manila envelope. The shares she's claiming were reallocated. A clerical oversight from when the company was restructured, nothing more. I didn't respond. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't give them the reaction they had come prepared for. Then the mediator set down her pen, looked across the table at my uncle's lawyer, and asked a single question. "Counsel, are you certain you understand who your client is dealing with?" The lawyer's hand stopped mid-reach toward his briefcase. The room went quiet, and for the first time since we'd sat down, my uncle's carefully arranged expression cracked at the edges. I had learned early that people who expect you to be small are most unsettled when you remain still. The boardroom at the Mediation Center on Bay Street in Toronto was nothing like the conference rooms I'd grown up imagining when my father used to talk about business. No dark wood paneling, no oil portraits of stern men, just a long rectangular table, ergonomic chairs, filtered light from tall windows, and the particular silence of a room where money and family are about to collide. My uncle sat directly across from me. He wore a charcoal suit he'd had tailored the same year the company went public. He was the kind of man who understood optics, who could hold a conversation with anyone and leave them feeling heard without ever saying anything he didn't intend to say. My aunt sat to his left. She had a habit of arranging her composure the way she arranged flowers, carefully, so the gaps didn't show. My lawyer, Rebecca, sat beside me. We'd agreed before we arrived that I would let her lead unless I was directly addressed. I would sit, and I would wait. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Fournier, had the kind of calm that comes from having sat in the middle of other people's worst moments for 20 years. She opened the session the way these things always begin, with formalities, with the language of process and good faith. My uncle's lawyer spoke first. He outlined the position clearly. The Hartwell family trust, established by my grandparents decades ago, had been amended 6 years prior to restructure the shareholder agreement following my father's death. The amendment, he explained, had removed my name from the list of beneficiaries on the grounds that I had taken no active role in the family business and had, by all reasonable measures, separated myself from the family's affairs. He used the word disengaged. He said it the way people say it when they mean something sharper but have chosen the professional version. Then my uncle spoke. He turned toward Dr. Fournier, not toward me. He had practiced this. I could tell by the way he breathed before each sentence. "My niece left," he said. "She made her choices, we respected that. But what she's asking for now, it's not consistent with someone who participated. She didn't attend board meetings. She didn't contribute to the decisions that kept this company running through difficult years." He paused. "Her name in that trust is a relic. It reflects a different time, a different intention." He looked down briefly, then back at Dr. Fournier. It was simply a clerical oversight that her name wasn't formally removed earlier. These things get missed when families are grieving. My aunt nodded with the expression she reserved for clergy and financial advisors. I felt the air in the room change, not visibly, just a pressure shift, quiet and unmistakable, the kind that comes before something gives. Dr. Fournier made a note. She turned a page. Then she looked at my uncle's lawyer with an expression that was not unkind but was precise. "Counsel," she said, "before we proceed, I want to make sure the record here is complete. Are you certain you understand who your client is dealing with?" It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even accusatory. It was a question that already knew its answer. The lawyer hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. "I believe so. Yes," he said carefully. Dr. Fournier held his gaze for a moment. "Good," she said. "Then we'll proceed with full disclosure." She looked at both sides of the table. "I'm requesting a complete review of all trust amendments dating back to the year of the original restructuring, including correspondence and authorization records." She set her pen down. "We'll take a short break." My uncle did not look at me when he stood. My aunt gathered her folder quickly. Their lawyer leaned in close, and I could see from the angle of his shoulders that whatever he was saying wasn't reassuring. Rebecca touched my arm lightly as the room emptied. "You all right?" "Yes," I said. She studied me for a moment. "They came in assuming you'd be emotional. They built their whole approach around that." "I know," I said. She nodded slowly. "That's going to cost them. I had not planned on being in that building. Not for this. Not like this." When I was younger, my father used to take me to the Hartwell Group offices on Saturday mornings when the building was quiet. He'd let me sit in the big chair behind his desk and spin slowly while he reviewed documents. He never explained the documents to me. He just let me be there. I think that was his way of saying you belong here, without making it a statement that could be argued. My father died when I was 22. An aggressive cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. He was gone within 8 months of the diagnosis. I finished my final year of university in a fog, graduated in the spring, and spent the summer in the house I'd grown up in, sorting through his things with my mother, who was already sick herself in ways we didn't fully understand yet. My mother's illness was different. It was slow, a degenerative condition that dimmed things gradually, her words first, then her memory, then her recognition. By the time I was 25, she was in a residential care facility in Oakville. I visited every week without fail. I paid attention to her medications and her care plan and her moods and her small victories. I learned to be present with someone who could not always tell me I was there. During those years, the family company kept running. My uncle had stepped into an expanded role after my father's death. He was capable. He was also, I learned gradually, consolidating. I had never been hostile about it. I hadn't demanded a seat at the table I wasn't ready to fill. I was focused on my mother, on finishing my credentials, on building something of my own. My uncle had framed my absence as withdrawal. What it actually was a 24-year-old trying not to collapse under the weight of losing her father and watching her mother fade at the same time. I didn't tell him that. I didn't explain myself to anyone in that family. I had learned early that explanations given to people who have already decided your story are simply raw material for a better argument against you. The amendments to the trust were filed quietly. I found out the way these things surface, not through a conversation, not through a letter with my name on it, but through a routine document request I'd made as part of my own financial planning. An accountant I'd hired flagged an inconsistency. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon and read me a paragraph from a summary filing. I asked her to read it again. My name had been removed from the Hartwell family trust. The stated reason was administrative. The date was 14 months after my mother had been transferred to memory care and could no longer sign documents or contest decisions. I closed my eyes for a long moment. I wasn't surprised. I was clear. This wasn't about money, not at its root. It was about the same thing it had always been. The quiet, persistent belief that if you manage a record carefully enough, you can decide who existed and who didn't. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It was my accountant again. "Can you pull everything you can find on the trust amendments?" I asked. "All of them. From the beginning." She could. It took 2 weeks. What she sent back was thorough and damning in the way that numbers often are. The amendments began 6 months after my father died, small at first. Language adjustments, scope clarifications. Over time, they accumulated into a full restructure. My name appeared in the original documents, then less, then once, then not at all. My aunt appeared throughout as a reviewing party. My uncle appeared as the directing authority. There was no record of anyone having consulted me. There was also no record of anyone having consulted my mother after a certain date. The dates after which her name stopped appearing in correspondence aligned closely with the dates her condition had made communication difficult. I sat with that for a long time. When I met Rebecca for the first time, she asked me the same kind of question my father's lawyer had probably asked every client. "What outcome are you looking for?" I told her the truth. "I want the record corrected," I said. "I want it accurate. I want the trust to reflect what my grandparents built and what my father intended, not what was arranged after the people who could speak for themselves were no longer able to." She raised an eyebrow. "Not damages?" "Not primarily," I said. "Accuracy first, accountability second. Compensation as a consequence, not a goal." She studied me for a moment, then nodded once. "I can work with that." We didn't move immediately toward formal proceedings. We started by requesting documents, certified copies of every amendment, every signature page, every authorization form. We tracked notarizations. We cross-referenced dates against my mother's medical records. We built a map. In Ontario, the rules around power of attorney and estate amendments when a party has declining cognitive capacity are specific. There are thresholds, there are protections, and there are questions that arise when changes to a trust accelerate in direct proportion to a beneficiary's inability to object. The picture that emerged wasn't complicated. It was just very clearly arranged in one direction. In the weeks before the mediation, my uncle sent one message through an intermediary, a mutual family friend who called me on a Saturday and said my uncle hoped we could handle things quietly, privately, between family, that this had all been a misunderstanding and that court proceedings would only damage the company's reputation and hurt people we both cared about. I thanked her for passing along the message. I told her I'd been trying to handle things privately for 3 years, and that the door to private resolution had been open the entire time. Then I said goodbye and went back to reviewing documents. People misread silence as indecision. They assume that if you haven't acted yet, it means you're afraid to. What they miss is that timing is itself a strategy. You don't move until the record is complete. You don't speak until what you say is irrefutable. You don't show your evidence until the moment it does the most work. That moment was coming. The break ended. We returned to the table. Dr. Fournier opened the session again with the same measured authority. My uncle's lawyer made one more attempt to frame the case as a matter of administrative error and estrangement. He was less confident now. The question Dr. Fournier had asked before the break was still in the room. Then Rebecca stood. She didn't open with argument. She opened with a request. She asked that the record include a formal introduction of my professional background before any characterization of my standing or engagement was allowed to stand unchallenged. Dr. Fournier nodded. Go ahead. Rebecca turned to me. Can you briefly describe your professional background for the record? I answered the way I'd answered questions in environments far less comfortable than this. Directly, without hesitation, without performance. I told them that I held a CPA designation and a Master of Laws, with a concentration in corporate governance, completed while managing my mother's care and maintaining my own practice. That I had spent the past 4 years as a governance consultant to mid-sized Canadian companies, advising boards on fiduciary responsibility, disclosure obligations, and the legal parameters of trustee conduct. That several of my clients were companies in sectors adjacent to the Hartwell Group's holdings. My uncle's lawyer stopped writing. My aunt looked at her folder. My uncle looked at me for the first time since we'd sat down. Dr. Fournier made a note without changing her expression. Rebecca didn't dwell on it. She moved to the documents. She introduced the timeline we'd built, not with drama, just facts arranged in chronological order. The original trust, the First Amendment, the second. The progression of my mother's diagnosis mapped alongside the progression of the trust changes. The absence of any record of notification to me. The absence of any record of consultation with my mother after a date that corresponded, within weeks, with the date her care team documented that she could no longer reliably understand complex documents. My uncle's lawyer objected twice. Dr. Fournier acknowledged both objections and continued. Then Rebecca introduced Exhibit D, a scanned copy of an email chain from 6 years earlier, my father's personal email address, sent to my uncle 4 months before my father died. In the email, my father had written about the trust, about his intentions, about me. The language wasn't emotional. It was precise, the way my father always was when something mattered. He had written that he wanted the structure of the trust to remain intact through generational transition, that his daughter's standing was not contingent on her active daily involvement in operations, that her place in the family record was not something to be revised by circumstance or convenience. He had CC'd a family solicitor. The email had been read and acknowledged. My uncle had never disclosed it. The room shifted the way rooms do when a fact lands that cannot be unfactored. My uncle leaned toward his lawyer. My aunt's hands pressed flat on the folder. Their lawyer asked for a brief recess in a tone that had lost all of its earlier confidence. Dr. Fournier denied it. We'll continue, she said. She looked at my uncle. Mr. Hartwell, she said. Were you aware of this correspondence when the trust amendments were authorized? My uncle said nothing for a moment. Then, I may have seen it. It was a long time ago. Did you inform counsel of its existence before today? A pause. I don't believe it was brought up. I see. Dr. Fournier turned back to her notes. My aunt leaned forward. My husband was managing extraordinary stress, she said carefully. Grief affects memory. These things happen. Dr. Fournier looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard that sentence before. I understand, she said. She turned back to the table. Let the record reflect that material correspondence relevant to the original grantor's intent was not disclosed in preliminary documentation. The mediation record will note this. She looked at both sides of the table. I'm prepared to move toward a recommendation. My uncle exhaled through his nose. His jaw was tight. He looked smaller than he had when we'd walked in. Dr. Fournier addressed the room evenly. She outlined her findings. The trust amendments, she said, while technically executed within legal parameters, contained significant procedural gaps. The absence of disclosure regarding the grantor's documented intent created a record that did not accurately reflect the original trust's purpose. The removal of a named beneficiary without proper notification or an opportunity to contest was inconsistent with good faith fiduciary practice. She looked at me. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "this mediation record will formally recognize your standing as a named beneficiary under the original trust. I am recommending that the amendments removing your name be reviewed and corrected to reflect documented intent." She paused. "I am also recommending that all parties engage independent legal counsel to oversee the correction process and that a full accounting of trust activities during the amendment period be submitted to all beneficiaries." She closed her folder. "This record does not allow a person to be quietly removed from a document their family built for them. It corrects that." My uncle did not speak to me as the session ended. He gathered his things with the careful movements of someone trying to look unhurried. My aunt didn't look up. Their lawyer said something to him in a low voice near the door. My uncle nodded once, stiff, eyes forward, and walked out without pausing. I stood at the window for a moment after they left, watching the street below. Toronto in November. Gray sky, yellow leaves still clinging to the maples lining the sidewalk, people moving with their heads down against the cold. Rebecca came to stand beside me. "They didn't expect the email," she said. "No," I said. "How long have you had it?" 3 months, I said. "We waited until it would do the most work." She was quiet for a moment. "You never got angry in there." "I wasn't there to be angry," I said. She nodded. "I know. That's what won it." The paperwork afterward was exactly what paperwork always is. Slow, detailed, conducted in offices where no one asks how you're feeling about any of it. Certified copies, revised schedules, formal acknowledgments. The trust was restructured to reflect the original language and intent. My name returned to the record in the place it had always belonged. I accepted what was mine. Nothing additional. No punitive claims. No attempt to remove my uncle from his operational role. He had built things too, and some of those things were worth keeping. What mattered was accuracy. What mattered was that the record told the truth. Some people expected more. A colleague asked me later if I was going to pursue further action against my uncle. I told her I wasn't. She looked surprised. "Don't you want him to face consequences?" she asked. I thought about it. "He did face consequences," I said. "He sat in that room and watched the story he'd constructed come apart document by document. He'll carry that. And now it's on the record." That was enough. My uncle called me 6 weeks after the mediation concluded. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered, "The way you answer things you've been waiting to have over." He didn't open with an apology. I hadn't expected one. He said the restructuring process had been more complicated than I probably understood. He said grief made people make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. He said he hoped I knew he hadn't intended to hurt anyone. I let him finish. "I don't doubt grief was part of it," I said. "But intent doesn't clean up a record. The work does." A pause. "Your father would have handled this differently," he said. "Probably," I replied. "He never would have created the problem in the first place." The line was quiet for a moment. Before he hung up, he said, "You're more like him than I realized." I didn't respond. Some things don't need a reply. They just need to be heard. A month later, I established a small bursary in my mother's name through the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. It was modest, enough to support 1 student per year pursuing a focus in elder law or estate planning, fields where the people most in need of protection are often the ones least able to ask for it. I also made a donation to Alzheimer's Society Canada in her name. It wasn't symbolic. She had spent years in a system that required family advocacy to navigate, and she'd been lucky enough to have someone doing that for her. Not everyone does. On a quiet Sunday in late December, I went to visit her. She was having a good day, the kind where the light seems to reach her more easily. I sat beside her and held her hand and didn't try to fill the silence with things she couldn't track. We just sat. I had brought a photo of my father. I placed it on the windowsill where she could see it if she looked up. She did, after a while. She looked at it for a long time. She said his name softly, once. That was more than enough. At my desk that evening, I opened the folder where I kept the scanned copy of my father's email. I read it once, The way you read something not because you've forgotten it, but because you want to remember the feeling of reading it the first time. He had written, "Her place in this family is not something that can be revised by circumstance or convenience." He had written it knowing he was going to die. He had written it and filed it and trusted that it would do what it was supposed to do. It had just taken a few more years than either of us expected. People often misunderstand what quiet persistence looks like from the inside. They think it must feel like restraint, like holding yourself back from what you actually want to do. But that's not what it feels like. It feels like clarity. You know what's true. You know what the record should say. You build toward it without rushing, without detours, without letting anyone else's narrative replace yours. You wait for the moment when the facts can speak without interference. And then you let them. If you've been written out of something that was meant to include you, something your family built, something a parent intended for you, you know how quietly that kind of removal works. Nobody announces it. Nobody holds a meeting. It happens in language, in paperwork, in the slow accumulation of decisions that individually seem minor and collectively amount to erasure. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to fight loudly to undo it. You need the facts, the time, and the discipline not to move before you're ready. Because records can be corrected. And people who believe they've written you out of your own story haven't accounted for the possibility that you've been quietly building a better one. If this resonated with you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories about holding steady when the ground shifts, about quiet accountability, and the kind of justice that doesn't require noise, consider subscribing to Steady Bearing. Thank you for listening.